Hi, in this video we'll go about reviewing chapter 2, which is about naming. This book, again, to quickly recap, is about how to improve craftsmanship of software developers, on how to improve the quality of work that software developers do. So naming is a pretty important topic because we spend a lot of our time as software developers picking good names to function names, variable names, class names, and file names, and a lot of names. So if we don't use the right names, then it's a big problem. So there are 12 tips in this chapter that I'd like to highlight. The book has many more. So let's go over them. So names should encode the intent. Like what is the why does this variable exist, what it does, and how to use it. So if that information is not in the name, then the intent is not in the name. So you should use names that clearly specify the intent of what it is, right? So instead of using e-pay, you could use things like employee payment info. So it tells you that it's an employee. The letter E doesn't tell you anything. So use good names that tell you the intent of why it exists, what it does, and how to use it. The second tip is to avoid using names that confuses the user who's reading this code, because if you use names like Unix, they already have a mental mapping of what Unix stands for. So Unix for them is an operating system, but if you use this in this variable or this file doesn't really have anything to do with Unix, then it confuses them. If you use a variable name like test list, and if it's not even a list, then they now are thinking that this maybe means as it's a list, but it's not a list. So it confuses them. So instead use clear names, right? Which are not fancy, which actually mean what you're saying, and it's not confusing. For example, if you use bust them down, it doesn't really mean, maybe you and few of your colleagues know it, but new people wouldn't know it. So instead use things like delete items, or instead of using whack, you use kill. It's easy to understand what it means, right? So use clear names that don't confuse the readers of your code, right? And the third tip is to use names with good distinctions. So like if you want to distinguish between two variables, don't just put numbers at the end saying list 1, list 2. Instead, really try to understand what does this list stand for. Maybe it's a product ID and the second list is product details, right? So name it product IDs and product details. It's very easy to distinguish between what these variables are. Just don't add numbers. It's very hard to know what 1 and 2 means. The fourth tip is to use names that are pronounceable. Remember, it's a social activity of coding. We talk to each other, we review each other's code, we design, we talk about pros and cons. So it's better to use names that are easy to pronounce. So like instead of using Dobiyam, which might mean date of birth in years and month, so instead just use date of birth in years and months. So it's easy to pronounce. People don't have a hard time pronouncing it. So use names that are pronounceable. The fifth tip is to use names that are easy to search. If you want to search for where this variable is coming from, you would use search a lot as a developer. So make it easy for you to search what you're naming. Make it unique. Don't just name them single characters, which is very hard to search, and there are many character matches, so it'd be very hard for you to find out your own references. So use names that are searchable, which are unique, not single characters and alphabets, right? Or single numbers. The sixth tip is to not encode types in the names, right? This used to be important before, where type safety and type enforcing was not available. But now if you name things like phone string to represent it's a string, it's not useful. Actually, it's counterproductive, because the container of phone could change from string to something else, or payment int could change from payment int to payment float. So that container of integer can become a float. But now your name is fixed to the container of that variable. So do not encode types in the names, right? Avoid using prefixes, things like m underscore description, because m doesn't really mean anything. So if you have to use prefixes, then name them well, like member underscore description. Or for an interface, don't just prefer to use I-shape factory or with a capital I at the front. Instead, use shape factory and shape factory import for implementations, right? So it's much more easier if you don't use prefixes. Also, one other tip was to use nouns for entities and class names, right? Like student, car, employees, and use verbs which are action oriented, right? For function names like posting something, deleting something, posting payment, or deleting page, right? So function names are best used as verbs, and class names and entity names and objects could be nouns. This is an important tip. Like when you come up with a name and you pick a concept, use that concept consistently, right? Like if you have something as a controller, then use that same consistent pattern everywhere. Don't somewhere use manager for the same thing versus controller, right? Interchangeably. So pick a concept and stick to it and use it consistently when you name. The 10th tip is to use use names that are different if they mean different things, and don't use same name for two different things, right? Like if you use pay info in two different places, at one place pay info stands for the amount to pay, and in second place pay info stands for the bank information, then it's hard to distinguish what is this pay info, right? So instead you should say employee payment amount and employee bank details. It's easy to know what this variable stands. So don't pun, don't use same name twice to mean two different things, right? And remember, your code is going to be read by software engineers or computer engineers, right? And they would understand the domain. So use domain specific names. And if you're in a specific industry, use specific industry domain specific names. So for example, account visitor indicates that it's using a visitor pattern. Job queue indicates it's using a queue. A builder, name builder, using a builder, right? So a lot of new engineers might not know this, but it's a good idea for them to know what these patterns are and use things that imply a lot of meaning. So use domain specific names. The final tip is to not use too long names and not use too short names. Lean more towards longer if you are confused, because too short reduces meaning, but too long is also very hard to pronounce and talk about, right? So use just right names and lean slightly more towards longer, but not too long and not too short. This is the final summary. Use names that have clear intent. There are 12 tips that I'm highlighting, but the book has many more. So intent is very important as to why the name exists, what it does, and how you should use it. Very clear, not ambiguous names. Distinctions between variable names should be easy. It should be searchable, pronounceable. You should not encode type information in the name. Do not use prefixes. If you absolutely have to, then add meaningful names. Use nouns for class names and object names, and verbs for functions. Use consistent names and patterns throughout so that you're not using different patterns and different concepts throughout. Use domain specific names and use the right length of the names, not too long, not too short, and lean slightly towards the longer if you have to. Few things to think about. Like now we know many tips on using good names, but like how would you go about encouraging everyone in your team or even your whole company to use good names? Because you would have to, as a software developer, review their code. They would have to review your code, and for this to work for a long term, everyone needs to use good names. How would you take this learning from this chapter and spread it? One thing that I could come up with is we could come up with a name convention document and then get all the new hires to go over it. And during the reviews, we make sure that we are adhering to the name convention document. So that's one way. I'd like to know, how would you think of spreading this? And please add your comments below, especially if you've encountered a situation where a bad name caused a big bug. Then I'd definitely like to know. Like for example, in one of my experience recently, a variable name didn't have whether it had a second or a millisecond information encoded in the time, and so the producer wrote this as a second, but the consumer assumed it's in milliseconds. There's a huge bug. So bad names can cause big problem. So have you had encountered a situation when there was a big issue because of not using a good name? So share that in the comments below. And also think about, how would you encourage developers in your team? If you're a manager, if you're a software engineer, when would you do the refactoring and how would you do it? Few ideas I have is, you should encourage everyone to refactor all the time, and also refactor it in a separate review, not as bundled into a feature review, right? That way it's easier for reviewers to review it. And what is the attitude that would you encourage your developers to follow? So I'm definitely interested in your comments. So add your comments below on issues you found with bad names, how to encourage people to use good names, and how would you go about doing it. So finally, the credits goes to the author. Great book. Definitely encourage you to go buy this book. I've given some highlights, but the chapter has much more details, and the author has done a pretty good job. So yeah, definitely go consider buying this, and add your comments below on some of the questions I had on how you do go about encouraging your team to use good names, and issues you found with bad names, and the attitude around good naming. Thanks again.